Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Person You Want to Be. I am your host, Eric Teplitz. Today, I am joined by two guests, sisters Karissa and Sherise Schlaht, who grew up on a farm in southern Alberta, Canada. Karissa is a finance nerd. Those are her words, not mine. Transformational leader in the banking industry, mother of two, and a passionate advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sherise is a student of the human psyche and condition, an addiction and mental health aficionado, a dog mother, and a highly sensitive empath. Their backgrounds in business and psychology intersect in Between Us, a podcast that provides an internal view of authentic entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs who are pushing against the status quo. Karissa and Sherise, welcome to the person, or in this case, the people you want to be.
Woohoo! Thank you. So happy to be here.
It's awesome to have both of you here. For those listening or watching, I appeared on their podcast some time ago, Between Us, and we had a really kind of an incredible energy, I thought, meeting pretty much for the first time and just connecting in a very easy, natural way. And so it felt natural to want to continue the conversation on this podcast. So before we even get started, for those who may not be familiar with the term intrapreneur, would one of you care to jump in and explain what that is as opposed to an entrepreneur? Go ahead. Go for it, Karissa.
Okay. I would say entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs are very similar in the spirit of they have a desire to change the world and make the world a better place. So an entrepreneur often is a sole proprietor or self-employed, and an intrapreneur is trying to create change from within the system, from within a large organization. So sort of like an entrepreneur working within a big company.
Great. And in this interview, I'd like to certainly capture each of your individual stories, but I also will kind of jump between doing that and perhaps talking about your relationship as sisters, and almost as if that is another interviewee in this podcast, almost another kind of entity of its own, because that's part of what's really intriguing about the show that you do, is that you bring your relationship into the show and your perspectives into the show, and you both, from my point of view at least, have kind of a yin and yang to your personalities. I think you each have a bit of the other in you. And so forgive me for oversimplifying, and please feel free to correct me during the course of this interview if I say something that really doesn't resonate with either of you as true, okay?
I would say that was very astute. Sherise and I very much are yin and yang, and I think complement and balance each other very well.
Excellent. And from my understanding, Karissa, you're the older, and using generalizations here, of course, kind of the one with the sunnier disposition.
That's correct.
And also more of a business. You come from more of a business orientation, and Sherise more of a psychology orientation, but each of you still has a little piece of the other. Would you say that's accurate?
That's exactly right. I would say, so while Sherise and I are both very highly aware, sensitive, intuitive people, my brain is definitely a bit more left in that it's very mathematical, systematic. I am definitely a wired optimist. I always see the good in situations and in people, which sometimes comes with its own downside, because I sometimes don't see what's directly in front of me. I'm not always realistic. Sometimes I see the good in people too much, and I'm just holding on to hope that they're going to be that person that I see. But that said, I would say I'm definitely the more sort of business and optimistic side of the equation versus Sherise.
Yes.
So what would you say, sis?
Well, I would say that probably the classic line for me that describes me best is "Hello, darkness, my old friend." My path actually to the light is through the darkness, and that's been a lot of learning, that I have to embrace that and accept it and fully feel it to get to that other side. But I guess the beautiful thing about our relationship is because I have the more, I would say, realistic orientation, No, I'm not completely pessimistic. So I always say I'm kind of probably walking the line between realistic and then, I don't know, between maybe realistic and pessimistic. But it's great because when Chris is riding on the coattails of optimism and seeing that future person or pursuit or thing, I can give a really healthy dose of reality. Help come, oh, how do I want to say that? The illusion comes crashing down. No. Yeah.
Well, I think maybe you serve to ground each other, right?
Yes.
Because if one of you goes too far
Yes.
on the positive or negative end of the spectrum, the other can kind of help center you and say, hey, yes, but also.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, we're like the reality check for one another.
Right. And
yes.
Now you're 3 years apart. Is that correct?
That's right. 3 years apart. And then we also have a younger brother, Jaden, who's 3 years younger than Sherise.
Right. And he is not part of your podcast, although maybe at some point, who knows, right? I don't know if that is in the works or not, but the podcast certainly centers around your relationship as sisters and the different perspectives you each bring to the conversation. And it's what's kind of interesting is that obviously you're not twins, you're 3 years apart. And so what that means is that for 3 years of chronological time, your relationship did not exist, at least not in the physical world, right? But for the duration of your conscious memories, I imagine, you've kind of always had each other, would you say?
Yes, that's exactly right. I can't even recall a time beyond the age of, like, I guess before the age of 3. Like, I don't even recall a time of life without Sherise. And even growing up, we were very close. Like, we were often playing together. In my firstborn fashion, I was often leading and mothering and bossing her around. But we've always had a very close relationship.
Got it. I'm fascinated by the sort of nature, nurture, the unanswerable questions in life, of which one is, how much is nature and how much is nurture in determining the people that we become. And it is, I do believe that we each are born with a pretty distinct personality. It seems apparent and kind of obvious, not even just with humans, but with animals as well, right? That we come into the world in a certain sense formed with certain inclinations, tendencies, and personality traits that are pretty much there from day one. Now, of course, our environment plays a huge part in determining how those personality traits play out in the world and in our lives. And our environments might encourage certain aspects of our personality and discourage other ones. And I think that's true for just about everyone in some fashion. It's just that some of us might feel especially thwarted perhaps by our environment if it's not compatible with the personality we come into the world with. So with that as a kind of context, why don't we start with Sherise, because you're probably used to everybody starting with Karissa since she's the older sister. Sherise, why don't you, if you would, tell me your earliest memory or memories of how you imagined yourself in the world, how you saw yourself in the world, and perhaps even who you felt you wanted to be in the world.
Yes, this is such a fascinating question because I feel like there was a conflict between what I felt internally, and I can remember this from a very young age, and in relation to what I was presenting to the outside world. So I was a very easygoing, happy-go-lucky child. Yeah, I think I presented that way to the world. I was very loving and empathetic. I was sensitive for sure for the majority of, or for all of my existence. But I can recall from as long as I can remember having this self-criticism and self-hatred on the inside. It wasn't reflected on the outside, but I was my internal dialogue was very dark.
From as far back as you can remember?
Yes. And so, and even little experiences, say I'd get some comment from even my brother because he liked to tease me. I would just so deeply internalize that. And I know we all do this to a certain degree or on a spectrum, but that would become the script for me. Like he would tease me about having like stomach rolls or something per se. And that would be a script in my head that would just keep replaying and replaying. So I was quite self-punitive on the inside. But like I said, that wasn't reflective of my personality on the outside. And I would say, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't want to interrupt you. But did you have any sense of, did you have any aspiration as a young, I mean, like as young as you can, as far back as you can remember, did you have any sense of this is the person that I want to be in the world? And it could have been like for a lot of kids, for instance, these ideas are extremely fanciful. And that's fine too. Like, you know, I wanted to be, you know, some kid might say, I want to be a pirate, or I want to be, you know, a princess, or I want to be a superhero, or what have you. Did you have any sense, were there any childhood fantasies or ideas of, you know, who you imagined Sherise to be in the world, maybe as you got older and came of age?
So absolutely. I was never a huge dreamer. That was something I've always had, a very, very practical mindset about things. But I do know I always had this caring, nurturing side. So I was always being like, you know, my brother would injure himself and I would be the doctor, right? I was like healing his wounds. Or with my sensitivity and love for animals, I thought, oh, I could maybe be a vet. But later I realized that is way too painful for me to deal with. So I think it was just, I always knew I had this caring compassion and I would be helping in some state or form. I wasn't sure exactly what that would look like, but yeah, it would definitely be of service in some way.
Got it. Yeah. Karissa, your turn.
I was just going to add, like, yeah, Sherise, like from a young age, I could tell you were going to be a healer, a carer and a healer, just in how you took care of everyone around you. I can recall, so growing up in a very small farming community, like a population of 200 people. The very first home that we grew up in was a little tiny white house with green shutters and a swing set in the backyard, probably 800 square feet, like very tiny. And even as a young child, I can remember sitting on the swing in our backyard, the sun shining down, and I can remember feeling like my life was limitless. I think in kindergarten, actually, when I was on stage, at the end of the year at our kindergarten grad, and the teacher asked all of us, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I remember saying, I'm going to be a pilot so I can fly anywhere in the world. And everyone in the audience laughed at me. And so I thought, oh, I guess that's not an acceptable profession to have. So I grew up with this juxtaposition of knowing what was possible for me, knowing what was inside of me, but feeling kind of like I was caged in a small community that I didn't know how to break free from.
Interesting. The word that jumped out at me from that description was limitless. And I wonder if you can elaborate on that. When you said that you felt you were limitless, is that right?
Yes.
What can you talk more about that?
Yeah. Like I think it's only been in the most recent years that I've accepted this for myself, and I'm feeling brave enough to say it out loud. I think I was always destined to inspire and have an impact on a broader audience of people. And so I know at some point I meant to be on a stage, I guess, if you will. And so that felt limitless. So I don't know if that means like at some point I'll be like doing a TED talk or but I know that there was something in me there was no constraints around how big I could dream. Like whatever I could dream, I knew I could achieve.
Got it. So this is interesting. Now, do you feel that the environment you grew up in, your household in particular, do each of you can answer these, you know, each for yourselves individually. Do you feel that your environment echoed the sense that you had of yourself, or did it contradict it? Did it impede it? Did it support it? You know, who would like to go first on that?
Go ahead, sis.
Great question.
This is Sherise speaking now.
Yes, this is Sherise. I feel like Karissa and our experience was pretty similar this way, where we did feel, or I did feel, I'll say, but impeding, definitely constricting, limiting, definitely not an environment that really fosters like individuality or even standing above or moving ahead, because it was such a small community and you're together from your day of birth till high school graduation. Conformity is the norm. It's actually probably quite like an older society where social conformity is the number one rule of survival.
Mhm.
And so I think there was a lot of sacrificing and limiting just to survive, per se, like not that we were threatened physically of our survival, but for our social survival.
Mhm.
And so I would just say not necessarily our household limiting that, but I do feel like our parents were just also both very busy building their careers, and there wasn't a lot of support in us growing or developing in our way. We just I feel like I just did it on my own with this knowing that the environment I was in was not conducive to that.
And Karissa?
I loved the word contradiction. I feel like who I am on the inside, it felt like a lot of the components of the community that we grew up in were in direct contradiction of that, because the community valued safety and loyalty and I can't think of the word that I'm looking for to describe it, but this sense, I guess, of like doing what you know, and being around these people was at the forefront of what was important. And I think this was probably a part of the conditioning from our family, because the community was so important to our parents. Like we literally watched them give all of themselves to our community to keep it going. Like, you know, in short of my dad is a farmer. So in short of, you know, literally trying to feed the world, and our mother being a school teacher and one of very few women in the community who were post-secondary educated and who had a job outside of the home. They also gave so much of their time to volunteering, to help building the local hockey arena. So it almost felt like I was betraying the community to step into my own individuality and to dream of a life that was bigger than the community itself.
Yeah, that's profound. And the way you describe it, again, I don't want to put words into either of your mouths. So would you say, from your perspectives, do you think your parents perhaps overplayed that giving inclination? Like, did they do it, in other words, because it obviously sounds great in a sense of like being giving and contributing to your community. Those are obviously positive things, but do you feel that they did that perhaps at a cost, or at an expense to who they were personally, or maybe even to you both and your brother in terms of what they were able to provide for you, not in terms of physical well-being, but other aspects of providing?
Absolutely.
Wow.
You have a different response to this?
Yeah. Yes, I do.
Yeah. Okay. So I would say my opinion of this is yes. I don't think that it was a conscious decision. I don't know how aware of it that they were. I think it was partially like how we were trying to survive in that system, in that environment. It was and I think they've also learned that from their parents, because I see this in my father's family system too, where loyalty to others, like community, your standing in the community, is more important than, like, how you're perceived is more important than even what's going on in your personal life.
Wow.
Yes. And so I feel like a lot of times in the community, people do gooding. And this is part, Eric, when you were talking about in your teenage years, that big disillusionment, that was for me too, because I'm like, all these people are fucking pretending that life is all good and look at how good we are and we're doing all these generous things. But then at home, it's a different story. And so for me, that was the disillusionment piece. Yeah, but I'm curious.
In other words, like how your family and the people around you presented themselves versus the reality of what they're experiencing. Yes. And again, I don't want to. I just want to clarify. When you refer to some of the do-gooding that was going on, was the do-gooding about how it looked versus, you know, or I don't mean, again, to oversimplify, but in other words, did you think that maybe your parents and or others in the community were performing these acts of service, at least to some degree, so that they would be seen as contributors rather than out of a desire to contribute?
I would say it's both and.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay.
Karissa, what, you have a slightly, or maybe not slightly, different take on it.
I have a different take on it. So to me, watching my parents give to the things that were important to them and that they were passionate about gave me permission to use my passion and my fuel to serve others. And so I actually have a beautiful, I guess, kind of story in my head about my parents giving back to the community. And it's something that I strive to do myself personally. However, it comes with a caveat, because I had that modeling of giving so much of oneself to others. I have a hard time letting my soul rest if I don't feel like I am stretching myself to the very brink of my limits. And then sometimes that comes at the cost of my own well-being. It comes at the cost of my relationships that are most important to me, because I get sucked into giving myself to whatever this passion is or whatever this cause is. So,
right. You do it at the expense of your own well-being. Like you push
it at
too
times.
far. Yeah. So did either of you perceive that your parents did something similar? In other words, they're giving. Did they do it at an expense either let me try speaking again here. Did they do it at the expense of either something that was important to them personally, or did they do it at the expense of their own well-being in some other way, physically, spiritually, or otherwise? What do you think?
My answer is yes again. Mm-hmm. I just think, I don't know, like just
did they deny maybe aspirations that they had? Did you pick up on that? Or
I think they were fulfilling their aspirations. I think the one piece that was holding them back is, I guess from, like I said, my perspective is that how we felt that there was some limiting and constricting factors about living in that environment. Part of just being so involved, although it was pursuing their passions and being involved in having that servitude orientation, it was limiting both of them from doing more as well. Like, as I think both of them have that similar yearning in their personality, or their, I don't know, whatever that is, a part of their soul. And I think being so also involved in that community did hold them back in some respects.
So what do you mean by more? Like not more of what they were doing, but more in a, like, other is how, what I took from that, more in like in other, they're not tapping into other either interests or capacities, or is that what you meant?
Yes. I'm trying to conceptualize this or use some words that are more descriptive, but I think it's just this exposure to more, as in different humans, different cultures, perhaps different friendships, even
other ways of being. And even I think time to be self-reflective. Like, there wasn't enough, because of how busy our household was, there wasn't a lot of space for there just to be being and feeling and talking and connecting. We were always doing.
Interesting. So the next question that comes to my mind is, you both, even though you came into the world with different orientations and personalities, it sounds like you both shared this feeling of the world not supporting each of your natural selves, and that you had to put on a certain presentation in order to be accepted socially and to kind of go along to get along, and to, be part of this community that had very implicit, or maybe even some explicit, rules about the way you conduct yourself and, the way you behave, right? So my curiosity is, what about in terms of your relationship with each other? Were you able to have a more authentic communication about who you each felt you were with each other privately?
Right. Karissa, you go ahead first, because I have an opinion too. So I'm curious.
Okay. There was always love. But I think Sherise and I very much both internalized all of this. and kind of just coexisted during that time. It wasn't until we went on to our own sort of journeys in adulthood and started doing work on ourselves and experiencing the world and stretching outside of our small community that we actually kind of came back together, and then we're able to share those experiences and have that deeper connection. But I would say, even though we always loved each other and spent time together as children, we weren't able to kind of, I guess, share in that pain, or we didn't know how to find a way to support each other in feeling different, I think.
Yeah, that was exactly how I felt too. I think we probably didn't even have the language for what we were experiencing, eh?
Yeah, I mean, you're probably weren't equipped to, you know. I was just curious, you know, because maybe on some level, part of your connection, even subconsciously, was driven by that. Not obviously, you know, there were many other factors, but that even though you may not have been able to articulate it or communicate it with each other, maybe in a felt sense, you understood each other.
Yeah, I would say that. Like, I think because we are both, you know, we're almost like simultaneously struggling with all of those things. And so I guess I had a knowing that she was struggling too.
Yeah.
We were both very private about how we were struggling, even though our struggles were actually very similar. We weren't influencing each other that way, but there was a knowing that she wasn't doing well, and there was a knowing I wasn't doing well in this environment.
And do you get the feeling your parents were oblivious to this, just out of their own busyness, perhaps?
Initially, yes.
Yeah, I think they didn't maybe understand the depth of our pain or how much we were struggling. Again, because on the outside, we still presented very polished and being straight A students and high-performing athletes, very creative and musically talented. So outwardly, we were still shiny.
Yeah.
But inwardly, I don't think they understood. I think they suspected there was struggle, but maybe didn't know to the full extent.
Yeah, I think this is really important to highlight, because from my sense of how things are in the US, at least, there is nowadays, when I speak with friends and hear about their kids who are, you know, let's say in high school or entering college, around that stage of life, I really feel for these kids quite a bit, because I don't think being a teenager is ever easy for most people. I think I mentioned on your podcast, I wouldn't do it again. I'd prefer not to relive that. But I feel like today's young people have so much pressure on them, because coming from so many different directions. I mean, they're the ones that have always existed: parental and societal and community pressures. But the competitiveness that I sense, for instance, here in California, we have state schools that used to be all about being able to provide, as a matter of principle, quality education at an incredibly affordable rate for its population. And at least that was the ideal. And now even those schools, not only are they much less affordable, but the competition, especially for the UC system, the University of California schools, is unbelievably intense and fierce, that you can be like perfect on paper as a student and not get in easily, because just from the sheer numbers, there's only so many slots, and there's, you know, 100 times as many people applying. So it becomes this incredibly fierce competition. And so I think that young people have to present the way you two did on the outside, of being basically perfect, right? Like being everything, anything and everything that their parents and or society wants them to be. And clearly this is not healthy. And also clearly, and this is not limited to just the US, but there are substantial mental health issues going on for people writ large, but also I think especially for young people. And social media is another ingredient. I'm not going to go too far down that rabbit hole, but it's another piece of the puzzle that puts, like incredible pressure on young people as to how they feel they have to present. Their highlight reel has to impress. And there's not perhaps much room for being authentic and showing any vulnerability or weaknesses. And so one of the things I admire about your podcast is that on your podcast, you both are attempting to open up this conversation about mental health, among other things. But, you know, these are important things that people are experiencing, again, on a very large scale. These are not uncommon problems that people struggle with, but it might be uncommon to speak out about them and to, you know, have dialogues about them. So I applaud the work that you do, both of you, on your podcast in that realm of just normalizing the struggles that most people go through. And of course, it's always, each individual's struggles are going to be somewhat unique to them, but just giving the space for the conversation to exist and allowing for, you know, yeah, I went through this, and, you know, just helping people feel not so alone in their suffering as maybe the two of you did to some extent growing up.
Thank you for sharing that. And I hope that's what we're doing with our podcast, is trying to shine a light on people's stories, trying to shine a light on who authentically they are, and really ultimately how we are all human, and it's our pain and it's the parts of us that we hide that actually connect all of us. And so it's been really important for me in doing the podcast that we try to showcase that, and we try to help, I guess, others feel a sense of connection, either to us or to our guests. I would say, reflecting back on my childhood, at times, I've been thinking about this a lot. Actually, I was watching on Netflix, David Letterman's My Next Guest, I think it's called. And he was interviewing Billie Eilish. He interviewed Will Smith right before the Oscars debacle. And in both of their interviews, they were basically examining, like, is this actually my story, or is this the story I've been telling myself, or is this the narrative I've been creating? And so I've been thinking a lot about that in stepping into this place in my life where I have the safety, but also the confidence in myself to be sharing the parts that are harder to share. There is also a silver lining to that. So while there was, you know, components of our upbringing that were challenging, I actually think the foundation that my community gave me, the values of integrity and loyalty, they're at the core of everything that I do. And I actually think they propel me forward. So as much as there was some pain, it's like I found a way to use that pain as a purpose. And it is like a fuel now, a hunger that I cannot satiate, because it gives me purpose for what I am here to do while I'm on this planet.
Yeah. And I also want to say thank you for picking up on your concept of the purpose of our podcast. And honestly, exactly what you stated succinctly summates my entire mission in life.
Wow.
Is exactly that. And, you know, I've been a person of the mental health system since I was 16. And so I began an inpatient treatment I had anorexia nervosa, and it was severe. So hospitalization started at 16 for me. And so 6 years of inpatient treatment between psychiatric institutions and then inpatient hospitalizations. But exactly the moment I had in those darkest, loneliest moments was, I never want someone to feel this alone. And so that pain turned into being my whole mission in life, is if I can bring some sort of solace or even just meet someone there, that is entirely my purpose. Yeah. So thank you for picking up on that. And I would agree with what Karissa said too, that the foundational aspects of, you know, loyalty versus independence, but having that loyalty and those integrity values and being an honest person, that's definitely what's helped me, I guess, given me any sort of success that I've had in life. It's probably from the same thing, those foundational values. So I agree with you there too, Karissa. Yeah.
And what's interesting is, so Sherise and I have alluded to struggles, but haven't said too much. So what's interesting is, when I was struggling, I also turned to an eating disorder to cope. And yet neither of us knew each other had an eating disorder at the time when we were experiencing it. So I would say for me, a shift happened when I went through puberty, and how the world perceived me, compliments about my talents and intellect, started to shift more towards my physical appearance, what a beautiful young woman I was becoming. And so I internalized that my value to others, and my identity was based on my looks.
Mm-hmm.
And so I became very acutely aware of how others were perceiving me, what I was wearing, my body weight, etc. And when my boyfriend at the time made a comment about another girl in our school being fat, I would have compared my body to be very similar to hers. And so I realized, okay, I need to do something to control this. I had no access to things like dietitians or a healthy way to stay well and whatever. And so I basically restricted myself to 500 calories a day. I ran every night after school. And at some point that no longer became sustainable. And so I turned to bulimia to then get rid of food so that I wasn't gaining weight. So I became bulimic at the age of 15, but kept it very secret, kept it very hidden. When I moved away from the small community that we grew up in to go to university, I met my now husband, Steve. And I was able to get out of the relationship that I was in, which was abusive. And I recognize now a lot of that abuse was his own pain and hurt, and he hadn't done the work on himself to heal himself from that pain. But when I left that relationship and was with my now husband, Steve, I think it gave me he's a very calm, stable, loving, like unconditionally loving person. And so when I had, I think, the stability of his love, knowing that it wasn't dependent on me needing to be or do anything other than be myself, it freed me from some of the cages I had created for myself. And so I was able to overcome the eating disorder without any intervention, which I'm so thankful for. Although I do think it kind of shifted from an addiction to food to drinking while in university to becoming a workaholic when I started my career. And so it did kind of shift, but I think it got progressively a little bit healthier each time. And now with, over a decade of counseling, having close relationships in my life with people who are loving and having the freedom to express myself, not only in my professional career, but also in my personal life, has allowed me to slowly unlock all of the cages that I had been in.
Wow. Yeah, one thing that I thank you for sharing all of that. One thing that I sense about the two of you that you have in common is that you are both quite sensitive, and that it's easy for you to, or at least certainly in your younger days, it was very easy for you both to internalize the needs of as they were presented of your environment, or the expectations that were presented of your environments. Because you both were so sensitive, it made you that much more compelled, let's say, to live up to or meet those expectations that were around you. And so again, this is kind of where nature and nurture meet. Because in a different, and again, it's not all good and bad as well, right? You mentioned that there were some extremely positive things that came from the environment you grew up in. So I think that that's also, almost inevitably the case. There are trade-offs to everything, and there tend to be, most things are not all good or all bad. It's usually somewhere, some grayness of both, capturing both. And so, for instance, just the quality of being sensitive, while I think probably on balance, it's perceived, I would say, probably as a more positive trait than negative, but clearly it can be beneficial, and it can be detrimental, just like almost any other quality.
Can I pause here?
Yeah, please.
So this is something that is so interesting to me, because my experience in the business community has been very different. So
don't show your sensitivity. Yeah.
Yes. So in addition to these messages growing up of don't show your full self, be perfect, don't show your full humanity, kind of hide your sensitivity or temper it. When I came into business, it was very similar. I can remember my very first boss. I cried in his office one day about something that I was struggling with, and he tilted his head to the side and said, "You're not as strong as you think you are." And so I started internalizing in my professional career that sensitivity was weakness.
Mm-hmm.
And I know now for sure that it is not. Sensitivity is strength. And it is part of what I'm bringing to the banking industry and trying to transform that we're all human beings. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's that sensitivity that's brilliance. Like EQ is probably as important or more important than IQ in business. And I think there is an evolution happening in business that is going to require our humanity to be at the forefront.
I sure hope so, because if it doesn't, I think our demise is going to be sooner rather than later. I'm totally serious about that. And actually, thank you for making that point, because it's true. It really depends on, again, environment, because you're right. I think that there are many environments in which sensitivity is frowned upon and looked down upon and condescended to and stifled, and like we never show our weakness. And you're right. And I think that on balance, that comes from a typically male, kind of male dominated, I mean, business has been a male dominated enterprise, and the culture is of being tough and of being, it's interesting. I mean, I'm speaking from, I guess, the bubble that I live in when I say that sensitivity on balance is looked at in a positive way. But you're absolutely right. There are so many environments in which it's not seen that way. But I guess to maybe clarify that a little bit is that on an individual level, the quality of being sensitive is, in my opinion, basically a good thing. But it can, like any quality, it can make us vulnerable to harm in ways that people who are less sensitive would not be. So it's like can be a double-edged sword. But you're absolutely right, and I thank you for making that distinction. And here you are entering the world of business, a traditionally male-dominated world, and boy, does it need a lot more humanity. And it's kind of intriguing, because I always grew up as more of a creative kind of personality and a creative soul, and pretty sensitive myself. And I have to admit, looked down upon business in a lot of ways, and felt like, business is for people who are heartless, and business is for people who are, like the opposite of creative and sensitive. Like they're just, let's get money, at all costs, and, people be damned. And which made me sick to my stomach. So I probably, maybe even to an unfair degree, looked at business as like bad, and I'm still having to overcome those beliefs about business, because I'm now in business for myself, and I am being forced to learn and have to, practice business in a way that feels right to me, but also that allows me to continue doing so, and to be able to sustain myself doing work that I believe in. So it's a tricky thing. And I think this is so interesting that, Karissa, you're the business person, more or less. Like, again, if we're stereotyping or simplifying, you're kind of the business oriented sister, and Sherise is more of the psychologically inclined, maybe counseling based sister. Although, of course, obviously, Sherise, you have started your own counseling business, and Karissa, you're trying to bring empathy into the business world. So again, this is that yin yang kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think this is something, as Karissa was sharing, that is just a difference between us. Like, I think Karissa was able to stay well enough, I guess, to survive in that system with her sensitivity. She could kind of not have that at the forefront, I guess. She was able to survive in that environment. And the difference that I think with me is, like, there's just zero survival or functioning for me in that environment. Like I said, the most I ever lasted in an organization was maybe 1 year, because it would just be, my wellness was not sustainable in those, just how the orientation was in the system. And so I just wanted to highlight, that's probably something that, I don't know, yeah, differs between her and I. And then also, I feel like I'm still navigating this space. Like, how do I, like you're saying, Eric, how do I support myself and function to some degree in this world, but in a way where I can maintain wellness and not be a longstanding psychiatric patient, essentially, right? So how do I stay well? And the only way I found that is to forge my own path, like you, Eric. And even in my business, there's still so many of the business interactions that are damaging for me and that take a lot of, like, okay, I have to process that, I have to work through that, and then also using that to be like, okay, now how do I navigate that differently, or how do I connect with different people? Because that sensitivity for me is just at the forefront. It's undeniable. There's no switching that off. And this is something that's quite interesting about empathy, is it's, again, on a spectrum, and certain people do have an on or off switch with it. Some people can turn it off, or some people can move it to the back of their being. And just learning about myself and accepting that is, I cannot.
Yeah.
By the way, I think only sociopaths can turn empathy off. However, you're right. There is, like, I think for me, I can kind of temper it enough, or I can like lead with this shell strength at the forefront and hold the feelings behind it to push forward. I don't know how to explain it other than visualizing how I feel when I'm doing it. So what's funny to me is I feel like I am fighting for a place at the table to help create some change in these business structures. And let's be honest, like, systems were designed by men, and for the most part, very like left-brained, systematic, analytical, competitive, financially driven systems,
Completely.
right? And so,
bottom line. There's a reason it's called the bottom line. That's the driver.
And I have this new idea. So I'm bringing my authenticity to the table. I'm using it like activism. And I think there's another way. There is another way. So I am fighting to create change at that table. And the two of you built your own damn tables.
Right. And, you know, I think this is really, really interesting territory, because sometimes, and maybe Sherise and I both are examples of this, we feel that we have to be everything and do everything. And we have to not only highlight our strengths in the world, but somehow strengthen up our weaknesses and get them to the point where they're also strengths. And there's a point at which, you know, we all have limited time and energy, not to mention different talents and dispositions. And so there's this question of, you know, do I cultivate my strengths, or to what extent do I cultivate my strengths? And to what extent do I try to strengthen my weaknesses, or either, if not completely overcome them, you know, manage them? And this is the thing, is that we're, you know, the expression, no man is an island, and, you know, no person is an island, and that we do need each other. And yes, while it's great to be, and of course in America, there's this incredible soup of influences that we're all swimming in, and belief systems that we're all swimming in, about how important it is to be independent and self-reliant. And we really don't like to see anything else, you know. But the truth of the matter is that we are all interdependent, and that, you know, the people I think that are the most successful, like, for instance, I always was interested in artistic pursuits, right? And the probably the most successful creative artists are the ones that are allowed to be themselves as creative artists, and they don't also become their own managers and booking agents and you know, lawyers and accountants, right? Like, that's why there are, you know, it takes all kinds, right? And if we can each bring our strengths to the table, I mean, we don't want to be paralyzed or completely decimated by our weaknesses. So to whatever extent we can, you know, improve upon those, that's always good. But there's this tension of, like, do I show up to the world from my areas of strengths and interests and natural inclinations, but I also need to survive. And so it's really a kind of a delicate balance that we each as individuals have to strike for ourselves, but also in community with others, whether that is, you described your relationship with your husband and how much he provided a safe space for you to be able to focus on what you're good at and not have to be so concerned about like the expectations of others to the same extent, in the same way, right? Like, and so we can provide these systems for ourselves, not just as individuals, but as families, as partners, life partners, as communities, as organizations, however it manifests. And as individuals, we don't have to and shouldn't have to, and probably can't anyway, even if we wanted to, be everything and do everything. So as sisters, how do you see your relationship in that sense, from helping to support each other's strengths and maybe compensate for each other's weaknesses, or just navigate the world together?
Go ahead, Chris.
Okay. So I think we're oftentimes both mirrors and supports for each other. And I think we're both augmented in a way that we actually kind of move towards our weaknesses, in terms of like being courageous and challenging ourselves to learn and grow. I think I'm speaking for both of us, sis, but please interrupt me if not. Like my whole purpose in life is to feel like at the end of my life, I have mastered myself. So while I think we all have a natural disposition to pursue the things that we're good at, if you look at, actually, there was a really interesting diagram that I saw of burnout. So along the y-axis was what you enjoy doing, with 10 being at the top, and on the x-axis being what you're good at. Our burnout zones are actually the things that we're good at, like 10 out of 10 good at, but don't like doing. That is our burnout zone. Our superpower zone of where we really thrive is things that we're good at doing and things we enjoy doing. So that's the key. And if there's anything that you like doing but you're not very good at, that like weakness zone of things is what I tend to kind of lean in towards and pursue. Trying to grow and strengthen myself.
Yeah, and I would say just because of Chris has a stronger foundational self than me, and so I would say that she has a more of a fervor, and you almost like you can attack challenge, right?
Yes.
And like my approach has to be very
fire.
Yes, I have to be very gentle. So like I'm kind of like I said, my spirit animal right now is the turtle. So I kind of like poke my head out at something and then I'm like, I'm going to retreat a little bit here. That was a little too far. So I have to have a really slow approach and gradual, and it has to be on my timeline. Like nobody can push me to do that faster. And so that's something I'm learning. But I also think, Eric, this is obviously my counseling brain, is what I'm thinking of. One of the gifts of trauma is that I feel like I have to know enough about my weaknesses so that I'm not taken advantage of.
Right.
Because that is such a zone for exploitation. And so this is a little bit of that hypervigilance where I have to know enough because I cannot give someone that complete trust. And yeah, do I think that's fully healthy? No, but I just know that's something that I'm aware of, and that's part of my being. Like I just have to have enough awareness that I'm not blindly being
taken advantage of.
Yeah. And again, it's why there is a place for all different kinds of traits and characteristics, right? Like sensitivity to a point can be very helpful. And then there's also a point at which if it's unchecked, it can be harmful. Yes. So, and toughness also is something identically that it can be an incredibly positive trait. And then there's a point at which it's no longer helpful or not what's called for. And I think that, it can be one of the really tricky things in life is figuring out maybe the limits of qualities in terms of how and when they serve us and how and when they don't, and what's called for and when. And the way I like to think about this often is, what I call efforting versus accepting. And
I love it.
And I very much come from an efforting inclination, like just through sheer will, like I'm going to do this, and I'm going to, like, no one can. I used to say, this is like when I was in my even early 20s, I used to tell friends that if nothing else, my epitaph would have 2 words on it. He tried. No one could ever fault me for not putting in the effort, right? But and efforting is generally a great quality, and of course, I think it's a very American value. Like, you work hard, and then if you work hard, you'll succeed. But what I learned the hard way is that efforting has its limits. Like, it can only do so much. And there's a point at which it serves you for sure, but guess what? There's a point at which it will destroy you. It will actually leave you, it will wreck you if it's unchecked, and if it's your only tool in your toolbox. And so what I have increasingly had to learn over my lifetime is that there, is introducing more acceptance and accepting, but again, knowing when is the right time for which approach.
Yes. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier, like doing and being, right? Like if we're just being, we're never doing. And if we're just doing, then we don't have you're right. There's always a balance there. Right. And trying to strike that balance and know when to do and when to be is.
And think about it, like, if you can't accept reality, it doesn't matter how hard you work to try to change it. If you're not coming from, it's like, guess who's going to win that battle? 100 times out of 100, reality wins.
Yeah, that's the definition of suffering.
Right. Yeah. Right. So, it's working with and accepting, and striking that balance of effort and acceptance. And I think it's one of the, at least speaking for myself, it's one of the key challenges of this existence, this human existence, is navigating that. And I have traditionally leaned on and maybe erred on the side of efforting. And again, it has its, and still to this day do. And so I think I'd like to think that I've evolved at least a little bit. I'm sure I have. And it's not been, I can't take all the credit for it. It's life insisting that I do, because that's what life does, is like, if you don't learn a lesson, it will keep teaching it to you and insisting that you do until you get there. And it's usually not a straight line.
And I was just thinking too, Eric, like, that's not even to your fault, because I just think that's such a highly masculine trait or ideal. It's like you're always asserting a space for yourself, and you can demand that space for yourself in the world, right? And so like that's just so tied up in the milieu of our culture, and even just you being a male, I'm sure that was even more, whether that was conscious or not, just subconsciously ingrained in your orientation.
Yeah, we are all, to use the metaphor, fish in our respective fish bowls. And I like to think of it as a soup that we're swimming in, and we're just not even aware of it most of the time or often. And it affects us way more than we would like to believe it does, or, think it does, or even can admit that it does. Like, it is extremely powerful. It's not the only thing. And this is, again, that nature nurture question. But ultimately, no amount of nature is going to overcome a complete and total lack of nurture. And maybe a clearer way of saying that is that our environment, while it does not determine everything that we can do or accomplish, it kind of sets the boundaries, right? Our environment sort of says, it really sets the limits, and it really, if we don't take care of our environment, and speaking of capital E environment, then we're going to be severely limited as to what we're going to be able to do, even just in terms of survival. So our environment has to at least be hospitable and sustain us. And we have to contribute to helping to sustain it so that it can continue to sustain us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the other orientation I was thinking about this for myself with being my turtle is the efforting has also been very wounding for me. Because I don't know, and this is probably like my internal dialogue piece, that I often didn't get the praise or recognition that I needed probably as a young human for that efforting. And so it didn't set up that I got a reward for the effort. And I guess it wasn't for the efforting itself, but I wasn't getting an outcome per se, right? I still have that internal drive and that, putting 200% of myself into something. But I think because I didn't get the desired reward or outcome from it, that it almost became wounding, and it severed that. It's almost like me putting all of myself out there and then getting wounded for it and then having to retreat. So I guess that's also been a learning for me in my business, is I'm trying to allow more to come to me instead of me seeking it, because that is a safe way for me of going about it.
Yeah, maybe in a more balanced way too.
Yes.
And it's such an interesting point, right? Because we're typically judged from the outside by our results,
yes,
and not by our efforts. And there are things that might take me an incredible amount of effort and that you could achieve easily, and we get the same result, but the journey looks so different on each of our respective ends. And I think it's crucial, at the very least, even if we don't get the recognition from the outside, I think it's really important that we honor ourselves for the efforts that we make, and also for the progress that we make, regardless of what it looks like on the outside, and whether or not it's even visible to outsiders. Really, is to have some kind of practice. And I'm a huge journaler, so that's one way in which I do that. But to have a way of recognizing yourself for the efforts made, regardless of what does or does not come from them. And by the way, efforts made, included within that phrase is type of effort. So in other words, like if something is a stretch for me, regardless of how that might look to someone else, if it's a stretch for me to do something and I muster up the resolve or the courage or determination, and I get myself to push past my discomfort and do something, then that's a win in and of itself. So, an example, let's say, in my younger days, it would take an incredible amount of courage for me to, let's say, approach someone I was attracted to actually just to even talk to them, right? And from my vantage point now is that each and every time I did that, I was building a muscle, and it's a win regardless of the result. Because, and here's another way that I like to frame it now, and it's taken me decades to crystallize this into 3 words. I'm really proud of it, so I hope you like it. Which those 3 words are explorations over expectations. This is hard to do, but the more we can approach things from a place of exploration, and the more we can, and we're human, so we can't be perfect at this, but the more we can detach from what we expect to get out of something. And if we just say, so like in the example of like approaching someone you're attracted to, okay, you are exploring this. You're saying, let's see if there's a possibility for some kind of connection. And so you approach the person, you try to engage them in conversation, and they might shut you down immediately. In which case, great, you got your answer. And you've won because you have done the hard thing. And now at least you've explored it, and it's a dead end. So now you can move on and go, explore in another direction. And rather than sit there and perseverate and wonder what if, and was that the only chance I'm going to get in life at happiness, and the things that we tell ourselves.
Does everyone tell themselves that? I don't know.
This is what I was gonna say. This is the perfect example of where our sisterhood, our relationship is like the only saving grace for me, because like Chris will say, like, for me, example, going on dates, it's so defeating for me, and it's like energy sucking, and I'm like, oh my God, this is like hopeless. And Crystal will say, like, don't you just feel great about yourself for like doing the thing or taking the risk? And I'm like, nope. Wasn't even a blip. It was a blip on the radar. I'm just going to straight demise, right? So this is where it's helpful we have each other, because
I'm glad that Karissa is a saving grace, but I think it's dangerous if she's the only saving grace.
Yeah.
So
that's true.
But and I think we all to some extent need to be our own saving graces.
Yes.
And we all need to learn. And part of, I think, adulting is learning how to parent ourselves and give ourselves the things that we need that may or may not have been given to us. And that includes emotional support, and that includes, giving ourselves credit.
Yeah.
Giving ourselves credit.
I would say, do you think though, sis, like I feel like I might give you that mirror, but it just reminds you, you're the one that actually gets to like come to that place internally, right? So I might say it like, well, aren't you proud of yourself? And then it forces you, I think, to pause, think about it, like, oh yeah, why am I not giving myself credit for it? Even if you don't fully feel it or experience it the same way that I do, you're doing that work yourself.
Yes. What it is now is I have a little Karissa on my shoulder. And so every time I go into those experiences, I just hear her little voice saying,
that's great. That's awesome.
Those things to me. And so whether or not Karissa's physical existence is here with me, I will always have a little Karissa on my shoulder. So
that's beautiful. Yeah.
All of those internalized voices, they can be used for good.
Yeah. But if you think about it, like, the majority of things in life are completely out of any of our control as individuals, right? But that said, where we have control is in how we perceive and respond to the things that we're presented with. And that's pretty much it. And it might sound like a very little amount of control. But it's huge, because if you can take ownership of that, the more that you can take ownership of that, I mean, it revolutionizes your experience of life. And so that this whole idea of explorations over expectations, if you think about it, it's like we're on a journey, and all we get to do is explore, and some things may delight us. In some explorations may delight us, some may not. But another thing that I notice, and this is like my own self-monitoring, is that I have had times in my life where I've experienced what I would call extreme disappointment. And I still do, right? Like to different degrees and in different contexts, where you get deeply disappointed. And I think that what I try to tell myself now is that disappointment, whenever you're disappointed, that means you had an expectation that wasn't met. And so what I try to just get myself to do is become more aware of that, more aware of expectations. And again, I try to do my best to manage my expectations. It's only natural. We're human. Of course, we're going to have hopes and dreams and desires and wishes. And, we're going to get our hopes up, because that's what human beings do. And that's not a totally bad thing. But managing that, especially if you're the kind of person that can get crushed by expectations that aren't met and by disappointments, then I think it behooves you or us to then just be aware of that, and to try to say, look, I don't have control over X, Y, or Z, but I'm going to explore it. And guess what? My life will be better for having done that. And I get credit for going on that journey because I'm choosing to do it. And I think it ultimately leads to a much more satisfying and fulfilling experience of life.
Yeah. And I guess this is something I'm trying to still navigate in my own healing journey. Is part of my process is I have to feel that demise. Because for me, if I interrupt that or try to interject it with a silver lining, or I deny myself of that reality that I'm feeling, it A, makes it worse, or B, prolongs my suffering. So part of my path is actually allowing myself to go there. Like there's that fine line where you're allowing yourself to fully feel it, but then you're not getting stuck in it, right? So I have to go there. And then my process is eventually I get back to the other side. But that's been, I guess, very helpful for me, because I think, I don't know, perhaps just having a different chemically set up brain, right? That just accepting that's the reality of where my mind can go, right? And I'm not just letting it run off and doing its own thing, but I have to really honor whatever experience I'm feeling.
Well, I'm definitely not saying don't feel your feelings.
Absolutely.
Like I'm a big believer. You have to feel your feelings, and you have to move through. It's the only way.
Yes, exactly.
You have to move through them, right? And the only way that's on the other side is to do that. You can't go around it. Like you have to go through it.
Exactly. But I do notice Karissa can glean the silver lining before. Like she doesn't get to the whatever that is. That's shitty part.
I move really quickly, so I can go in and feel it all, but then I can synthesize it, see the silver lining, what I learned from it, and move on.
Move on. Yeah.
So, and I think sometimes Sherise gets stuck. Like you get in, feel it all, and you have to get into like the depth of the pain, and then sometimes it can be like debilitating, understandably, once you're in there. So I think what you said, Eric, is key. Like you have to allow yourself to feel it, but move through it. Not get stuck there.
Yeah.
To keep a sort of curiosity about it.
Yeah. That's the other part.
Why am I feeling this way? You know, what can I learn from it, but just looking at it from a playful lens of what is this teaching me?
It's all information.
Yes.
And it's removing the judgment. It's removing the judgment or the label of the experience. And you're looking at it neutrally, saying, what is this here for? What is this teaching me? Yeah,
what can I learn from it? Certainly is a good thing. And of course, by being an empath, you're naturally going to feel things perhaps on a deeper level and maybe for longer. But again, that is part of your strength as well, because you can serve people and make people feel less alone through that empathy.
Yes.
So your challenge, at least it appears to me in part, is to figure out a way to protect yourself and still shine your light and benefit from the gift of your empathy and have others benefit from it as well, but not to the expense of your own well-being. And so the challenge is to figure out where to, what kind of boundaries to set and what kind of methods you might come up with to protect and nurture yourself so that you don't get completely drained and depleted. And these, like, we all have some version of this, I think, but that's what I sense it looks like for you.
Absolutely. And then it's also that the pain doesn't color the entire world. That's not painting the brush for everything and everyone, because that's where I get stuck. It's like the hopelessness of life and the experiences, and then I think all of life is hopeless.
Right. And that's where having a Karissa on your shoulder is, like, really, like, even if you came up, like, if you literally made something out of ceramic that was like a bird-sized Karissa that you could literally take with you and keep, if not on your shoulder, then like at the ready, that might be an example of a tool that can help balance out and not let you be overcome by that despair. It's I take heart in the fact that everything we experience in this lifetime is inherently temporary. And I actually see that as, like, I don't want to get too into this, but if there is any kind of mercy that exists in the universe, and I don't know if there is, of course, I would like to hope and believe that there is, but if there is any kind of mercy, I think it exists by design or just by default in the inherent fact that everything that we experience is temporary. So even the bleakest, darkest, most despairing, most tragic, most nightmarish moments of our lives are going to be over. It may not feel that way, but like, to me, I see that as a blessing in a sense, like that the worst thing you can imagine, certainly from the perspective of geologic time, doesn't even register. It goes by so fast. Of course, by our human scale, it's magnified and feels much bigger and larger and longer. But so having perspective is helpful.
And that's
sure.
exactly what I think the only, because Chris always talks like lots of times when she's in even a deeper, darker space, she still has the foresight of the future. Right. And when I'm in a very severely depressive episode, the future is non-existent. But the one little thing I glean is like, I just say this too shall pass. Right. And I'm not religious by any stroke of means, but that is the one thing I just have on loop in my brain. This too shall pass. This too shall pass. It's not forever. It may feel like that, but yeah. And
of course, the flip side of that is that the same goes for the things that bring us joy.
Yes,
is that
absolutely.
they're also incredibly ephemeral, and that's why they're worth noticing and savoring, and
not clinging to.
Again, hard to do for us humans.
Yeah.
Okay, so we could obviously go on for hours. That's what really struck me when I first met both of you, is that we had this kind of just natural, I don't know, just way of connecting and relating, and it felt very easy, and like we sort of, I don't know, we're both intrigued and sort of understood each other on some level. Like there was just an ease of connection, I think. So I really appreciate you both joining me on this podcast. And I'd like to ask each of you, at this stage of your respective journeys as individuals and as sisters, where do you see, who is the person that you most aspire to be now? What does she look like? Whoever wants to just take that first. Karissa, why don't we start with you? At this moment, who is the person Karissa most aspires to be? What does that look like for you moving forward?
When you ask that question, the image of a photograph of me at age 5 is what came. The woman I aspire to be is who I always have been. I aspire to be me, fully free.
Wow.
Beautiful.
What do you think, what are the barriers to that? What is in your way, or what?
Ironically, I think only me. It's like we all create these stories about our limiting beliefs. We all have fear. We all, we all have limitations, I guess, that we place in front of ourselves. And so my life's work is to remove them one by one, so that I can fully master myself and be the 5-year-old me.
I love it. It's beautiful.
And that, I just want to say that answer surprised me in an amazing way, because for so long Karissa has been searching for her mentor, or the light that she's like searching for, that person to be that thing for her that's going to take her there.
Or an example of like, I think probably is another symptom of growing up in a small community where there weren't a lot of working women or women who looked or thought like me. And then working in a male-dominated industry, like I have yet to meet myself 10 years or 20 years or 30 years down the line. So that is cool, since I hadn't actually considered that. So maybe that shows some progress on the work.
Maybe that serves as part of your motivation to be that person for others, right?
I think that's what I'm saying. Like I see that's a shift, and that's been a relatively short amount of time, which is also Chris's way. She can switch and pivot very quickly. But I just wanted to, I guess, point that out and honor that for you, Karissa, because that's, I don't know, that within a year, I would even say that's a shift. So yeah, I like it. Yeah. And my answer is, I don't have mine is going to be a little bit, I guess, more energetic or spiritual. I don't have a physical vision or being. All I have is a knowing. So I know what flow and connectedness and aliveness feels like. And that is what I want to sink into and continue following. It's very elusive, but yeah, there's not a physical form attached to it. It's just a feeling.
And I think both of us are on a mission like humanity over everything.
Yes.
And when you say humanity, again, there's different ways of interpreting
Yeah.
that. So how do you define humanity when you say humanity over everything?
It is that sort of inner child, that inner authentic person of, like, I dream of a world where we all lead with that, that we all lead with the person that we try to hide inside.
So authenticity.
Creating a world where we can all fully show up as ourselves with authenticity, and that comes before everything.
Yeah. And again, like, I just want to say, I was 5 minutes late to joining everyone, but this is a perfect example of that. Is somebody needed to talk to me. They were in a little bit crisis, whatever you want to call it. And knowing I had this, I still had to honor that person. I couldn't just say, sorry, I can't deal with this right now. You know what I mean? And for me, it's not in big sweeping moments, it's in little moments. And so I thank you for your flexibility with that. I'm very not Western in my time orientation. And so I apologize because it always comes across as being disrespectful, but I'm perpetually prioritizing people, which is at the expense of time.
And this is another, I think, like, sort of juxtaposition and also beautiful balance that Sherise brings. Like, I am moving towards this grand vision, and Sherise is just embodying it every single day in every single interaction.
Thank you. Yeah. And that's honestly how I make there's a lot of decisions that happen in my day, but I'm making decisions that move me towards that feeling or that knowing, like on a very microscopic level.
Yeah, I like that, because the way I think of that is paying attention to the things that feed us and nourish us and nurture us, and leaning more in those directions, and noticing the things that maybe drain us or deplete us, or even that are at an extreme level toxic to us, and learning to steer clear of those. And, of course, we never get to life isn't supposed to be nothing but beauty and love and joy. It's a mixture of things. But I think that the more we can tune into what we know is good for us, the more able we're going to be to show up in the world and be our best selves.
Yes. Beautiful. That's
so exactly before we end this, thank you again, both. It's been an awesome conversation. I knew it would be. I'm just curious, Sherise, I've seen for moments at a time these tattoos on your arms, and I'm wondering, for those listening, they may not be able to see them, but for those viewing, if you can perhaps show us those tattoos and explain what they are, what the significance is, because they're in one photo that I saw, it was just very striking.
Yes, thank you. I've spent a long time looking for tattoo artists, but I guess this ties into, for me, my spiritual orientation. I gravitated towards the Eastern philosophies, probably at the pinnacle, probably at 16, at the pinnacle of my mental health crises. And it was the only thing that made sense to me, that mirrored my movement through the world. Like, even this idea of non-doing or non-efforting is like wu wei. It's a practice, right? So I guess any sort of philosophical guidance I needed, I've always gone to the Eastern philosophical orientations. So the first tattoo on my left arm, if people are going to look at the video, is a modern day geisha. It's the face of a modern day geisha. And so for me, it's just the emblem of the female empowerment of the feminine, the divine feminine, but in a way, like I said, modernly, that I kind of harness the warrior when I need it, if that makes sense. And then the other arm it's a Buddha, a baby Buddha who's going like, shh. So it is the start of a sleeve about Buddhism or Tao, which is the philosophical approach I practice. And it's just this getting quiet with ourselves, listening to that inner guide, that inner knowingness. And I only think we can achieve that through stillness and through silence. And so I just like having the physical reminders of those on my body and paying a lot of money for them.
Yeah, well, where we spend our money is reflective of what we value, whether seeing that, however that makes us feel, it is truth, right? It is the truth, right? Like where we put our money, the expression, put your money where your mouth is. I mean, where we spend our money, it shows what we value. And to have those literally, painted on your skin is a testament to how deeply important those values are to you.
Yes.
They're actually beautifully done as well.
Thank you.
They're very striking.
Yes.
They're beautiful. I won't show you mine. Mine actually is in my husband's writing, and it's a quote that I had written down in a journal, I think at the age of 18, from Anne Frank, which is, I don't think of all of the misery, but of the beauty that still remains. And I chose to get it tattooed on my rib cage, on my abdomen, to symbolize, I guess, the recovery from both the eating disorder, the abuse that I faced, and also Crohn's disease and some of the digestive struggles that I've had throughout my life. So
profound stuff.
Yeah.
All right, then before we go, I also want to ask, I asked about you individually as to the people you aspire to be at this point in your lives. What about as sisters? Where do you see your relationship? And the podcast obviously is one manifestation of this, but how do you see your relationship moving forward at this point? And how do you want this relationship to appear in the world and in each other's lives moving forward as sisters?
What a beautiful question. To me, it's an extension of our love. It's an extension of our journey. And I also want to point out that not all relationships are, actually no relationship is easy. No, especially when it comes to family dynamics, like they can be complicated, and it can be messy, and it can be painful.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so I don't want,
I'm hearing about this.
Yeah. I don't want listeners to think like there's like this disillusionment that our relationship is like this perfect sisterhood. Like it's a constant evolution. It's constant work. But there is such an unconditional love at the core that I know it means we'll walk through life together.
Yeah, beautiful. And I guess the point for me too is I feel like the more we learn about ourselves and each other, I think we're developing enough safety now in our relationship to actually disagree, because that wasn't always present. And especially, I don't know, I'm especially people pleasing too. We both are. But it was just because I'm such a conflict averter, I wouldn't share my opinion with Chris, or I wouldn't disagree, and so now I feel like we have the foundational security to do that. So I think for the first time in our relationship, I'm challenging her too, or saying, that doesn't work for me. And I think in the past I would have been very silent about that. But in the same sense, it's making us so much closer, bringing us so much closer, because we understand each other so much better.
That's lovely. So their podcast, again, is called Between Us, and you can find it in the usual locations where people listen to podcasts. Do either of you want to say anything more about that as we close out today's interview?
No, I think you should be our publicist, marketer. You did such a great job of articulating the vision that we had for it and putting it to words. So thank you for seeing us and for being so generous with having us on.
Yes. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you, Eric. And like we said, we can go for hours upon hours upon hours. And I appreciate you sharing your perspective, because it's also a good accountability check in a way that what are we putting content out there that is aligning with what we're attempting to do. So thank you, because that reaffirms that we're on some sort of path.
Yeah. And thanks to the technology gods, as it were, that made both of our podcasts possible, and that made connecting with each other possible. So just want to remind listeners, I'm going to sum this up on a positive and optimistic note, which is just that there's a lot of darkness in the world. And of course, the media and the news overwhelmingly focuses on it. And it's very easy to get sucked into despair and to lose hope, lose all hope, and to give into fear and terror. And, you know, for good reason, there are a lot of real threats out in the world. But I like to remind both myself, and I'm saying this as much to myself and for myself as for anyone else, that there's so much more than just what is emphasized in the news and in the media and the awfulness, because the things that are newsworthy tend to be the ones that are the most frightening and shocking. But the truth of the matter is that every day and every moment, there is human connection going on this planet, and that there are caring people doing beautiful things very quietly, very subtly, maybe very under the radar. And that is essential. And that there is a massive amount of good and good potential within each of us and within all of us. So on that note, this has been between the three of us,
Yes.
the Person You Want to Be podcast, Karissa Schlaht, Sherise Schlaht, and myself, Eric Teplitz. It's been a total pleasure and joy speaking with you both, and look forward to connecting again soon.
Great. Thank you. And have a wonderful day.
Take good care.
Thank you.